Hello and welcome to the Lund University International Podcast. On the show, you'll hear from current students, alumni, teachers, and many more special guests as we explore what it's really like to live and study in Lund. My name is Helga Heun, and I am a communications officer at the Lund University Alumni Relations Office and the Alumni Network. Today we have a very special guest who embodies the perfect career in academia. The transformation from being an international master's student to becoming a professor right here at Lund University. Joining us today is Michael Bossetta, a political and data scientist, a social media expert who teaches in the Department of Communication and Media, a podcast host and creator, and of course one of the nearly 50,000 members of the Lund University Alumni Network. Thank you for being here, Michael. So how did you get here today? Do you own a bike like everyone else in Lund?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. Absolutely, I don't own a bike. I have for many, many years, but I have made the switch over to an electric scooter, which are more and more popular because you can take it on the train without paying for a bicycle ticket.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Huh. Well, can you take me back to the moment that you made a decision back in America, in Louisiana, to come to Lund, Sweden?
Yes, and it's actually kind of an interesting story in the sense that I had not heard of Lund before applying to this university. And my motivation for applying was actually a form of, I would call it tuition arbitrage, in the sense that arbitrage is when you buy something at a low price and sell it later for a high price and you make on the difference. Well, it was up until I think 2011, tuition in Sweden was free. So you as an international student outside of the EU could study a free master's degree in Sweden. So I had done during my bachelor's an exchange in Copenhagen and wanted to go back there. So I was looking, how could I do that? Well, I could go to Lund, which is close to Copenhagen, and not pay the tuition fee that is so high in the US. So that's actually how I found Lund via Google, looking for ways to get back to Copenhagen.
All right, but you first landed in Copenhagen then. So in general, what made your decision to at all come to Scandinavia then?
Yeah, so I was studying philosophy for my bachelor's, and I was very interested in existentialism. And the well-known father of existentialism is Søren Kierkegaard, who is a Dane. And so my thought was, I want to go study Kierkegaard. He was one of my favorite philosophers in his natural context, in the deep winter of Scandinavia, where all this writing about man's role in society was started. So that was my original motivation, to go and study Kierkegaard in his natural context, which I can recommend, but it definitely puts you in a strange headspace.
And as an American, what did you feel was the biggest culture shock to you coming in from Louisiana, and then maybe your experience in Copenhagen, but also in Lund?
Yeah, I'll speak to Sweden because, from the outside, from looking over in the US, Sweden and Denmark are very similar. But once you live in both places, you find very, very stark differences between the two cultures that are not really so obvious from the outside. So when it comes to Sweden and Swedes, so I've listened to a few episodes of the International podcast, and I've heard some guests talking about Swedes being cold and reserved, and that's often quite the stereotype that Swedes have. I have a bit of a different explanation, which is that in Sweden there is a very strong norm and culture or set of expectations around how to behave in public. So how one talks to others, but also acts in public is very sort of defined, I would say. And that's something that you have to move to Sweden and experience a little bit to understand what are those norms and expectations. And I'll give you a concrete example. So when you're on the train, of course, if it's in the morning or the afternoon when everyone's coming home from work, then people sit anywhere because it's crowded. But when it's not crowded, you're not really expected to sit next to a stranger. So you have on the train 2 seats on each side, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. But if you actually look down the train carriage, you'll only see that there's one person in each seat. And even though that there is wide open seats on the train, some people choose to stand up rather than sitting next to a stranger. So that's just one thing that, of course, it's fine if you do it, but a Swede would think twice before doing that. And that's something that you only really come to learn by being here. And it's part of how to behave in public, respecting others' spaces and expecting them to show the same for you.
So you think it's an unwritten code in our cultural DNA, so to speak, that you don't sit next to people on the train?
Well, that's just one example, but I think there are many such examples of what to do and what not to do. We have the classic examples are getting your ticket before standing in the queue. And there's many others that are, it's not so big of a deal if you break them, right? But there's just a set of unwritten rules that makes how you should act and behave in public understood by the rest of people in public space. Private home is different, but in public, there are certain unwritten rules.
If you could ask anyone in Sweden before, if you go back to yourself as, I don't know, how old were you when you were making this transition from America over to Lund?
21, maybe 22, right. Something like that.
If you could ask for any advice from a person living in Sweden about what mistake to avoid going here, what would it be?
I think I'll answer your question this way, which is when I came to Lund, I was going to move into Spolatorp, the International Student House. And for some reason, my idea of international was European. I guess because Lund is in the EU and it's, a European university, I thought international meant students from across Europe. And what I learned is that international is a much broader scope. People from Asia, from Latin America, from Australia, for example, Middle East. So I think what I would tell myself as a piece of advice is not to have these kind of blinders or curtains of thinking about international only in terms of one continent or one part of the world, but actually international is truly global. And I see that in my classrooms. Even today, I'll have a class of 40 students and they're from 35 different countries. And that is something that I really think is special to Lund University, that other universities have international programs, but the scope of that internationality is not as broad as it is here in Lund.
Well, you're different in the way that you studied here and now you're actually teaching here. So could you explain a little bit about how you went from your study area of philosophy and then on to European studies and then ended up in communications?
Yeah, it's actually bizarre. I teach in the same classrooms that I was a student in more than 10 years ago, which is a funny feeling. So I think jumping from subject to subject area, as I have done, I think is a teachable moment in the sense that you don't have to have your life planned out. And there is actually zero connection between the various subjects that I've studied at bachelor's, master's, PhD, and actually where I work now. There are 4 different subjects, and they are not necessarily connected, but they represent different ways of being open to new opportunities. So that's also an advice I would give myself, and I would also give to the listeners, that you shouldn't plan things too strategically or too rigid, because there's a lot of flexibility that can happen. And if you follow that flexibility, a lot of times it will work out in the end. So I hopped from subject to subject for different reasons, came to Lund to study European studies because it was tuition free at the time, not because I was dying to study European studies. I would have taken a master's in chewing gum if they would have offered it. But it was just what program would take me. And that led me here to Lund. And while the program was great, when you're studying European studies, there's what you learn in the classroom, but then there's also all the experiences you have with people who are European, but also from, border countries of Europe. And so you get that kind of dynamic of third countries, but also what is Europe's role in the broader global system? You have all sorts of input from people who are coming from different parts of the world. And so it was really more that cultural exposure and discussing similar issues from different perspectives that I took away mostly from that master's, not so much the theories of European integration that I could still recite, but maybe not as well as I could back then.
So do you have your own ancestry back in America? Do you, like, what country is your ancestors from?
Yeah, so New Orleans, the city that I'm from, is a large port city. It's where the Mississippi River enters into the Gulf of Mexico. And that's important because you often think of New York as the major port of immigration for the United States, and it is. There's Statue of Liberty, all that stuff. But New Orleans was the second largest port at the time. And so New Orleans is really populated with a lot of Italian and Irish migrants. And so I'm a mix of that. That heritage, but also many people that live there have the same as well.
Do you think that played a part at all in your interest in European studies, or not so much? It was more the tuition fee. Well, it was the free tuition. It
was the tuition fee, and which, unfortunate, isn't as accessible as it was. Although there are still, of course, various scholarships that can help with tuition. No, it was a difference in academic culture between Europe and the United States, where in Europe, you're expected to do a master's in the same subject you've done a bachelor's in, right? If you've done a psychology bachelor's, then you can do a psychology master's. But if you've done a business bachelor's, it's hard to do a psychology master's in Europe. In the United States, we don't have that exact system. So I had a philosophy degree, and what could I apply to? Any program that would take more of a humanistic background. And so that program is based in the humanities. And so, they would take me. So, I was happy to join them.
All right. And then from there on to communications.
So communications, right. So I have no formal training in media and communication, which is hilarious, I think. But I grew up, as I think many of the listeners of this podcast do, grew up with social media. And I mean, I remember logging into Facebook on a flip phone, when text messages were 25 cents. And so it was just something that everyone was doing, and we all had, Facebook and later Instagram. And then when I started doing my doctoral studies, I was seeing that many of the people who were studying social media, they were much older professors, right? They were looking at things like the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street and protest movements. But they didn't really understand the technology like we did. I think we had much more experience really kind of riding the wave of Facebook from its beginning to these sort of large-scale events. And so I realized that older professors didn't really understand the technology to the same extent that I did, just as an average user. And I had something to contribute with that. And I think it's the same thing today with, nowadays, I have no idea what's going on with TikTok and Discord and all the various platforms, but there is a younger generation of students who later could become scholars and provide insights into academia about those technologies that I'm now disconnected from. So I think the pace of digital media is evolving so fast that we constantly need new recruits and new knowledge to share those experiences in research.
But was there any key person or key event or anything that sparked your interest?
There was the rise of Euroskepticism in 2014. And way before the concept became as popular as it is today, the idea of populism and leaders like Nigel Farage, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ted Cruz, those were the original cases of my PhD thesis. They were starting to become very popular, and it was very much, is the European Union going to crumble in 2014? Obviously, it hasn't. But these politicians were very strategic in their use of social media, platforms like YouTube and Instagram in the early days. And so that was kind of the connection with politics, was looking at, okay, how are these politicians performing on these platforms? Because they're not just, opening up their phone and talking direct to camera. They are strategically planning out strategies for these platforms. And I was looking at the connection between those performances, perceptions of authenticity, and their strategies and the teams that were crafting those strategies. And then I completely changed topics to something different. But that was the original plan.
And so you did your PhD over in Copenhagen again. You went back to Copenhagen after studying here in Lund.
Yes.
And then how did you get your job as a teacher?
How did I get my job as a teacher?
How did that happen?
Again, another form of education mobility. So there are certain grants, and this is everything you have to do in academia is get the grants. Yeah. So there are certain grants where you actually need to move countries to be eligible. They're called mobility grants. So the European Union has a set of grants to have researchers move and start positions in new countries. And as you've probably heard from, this short conversation, I'm a big fan of Denmark and Sweden and this part of the world in general. So I didn't really want to move, but I could move countries by relocating from Copenhagen to Lund, which is about 45 minutes by train. So technically I met the criteria, but I didn't move that far, although I did move from Copenhagen to Malmö.
Okay. So you reside in Malmö?
Indeed.
Yeah.
This is how I know about the train customs.
True, of course. To go back a little bit to exactly more in detail, like what steps did you take in order to move your career from PhD to becoming a professor?
Yeah, it's tougher and tougher these days with the academic job market and budgets are tight. But there was a job opening in media and communication. As I told you, I don't have formal training in media and communication, but I was here at Lund, and I think that's important. It's more difficult to recruit people who are far away and you don't know them, whereas I think it's easier to be based somewhere and build that network out. So kind of keeping with the theme of this podcast, I mean, if you come to Lund or any other university, you're going to build a network there. And that network is going to, in a sense, incentivize you or give you benefits for anything you want to do in that town or that part of the world. It builds a connection that you then can build out from. And so I don't think I would have gotten the job without having been a student here or having moved here actively as a researcher. But my network was here. And this is why actually I did my PhD in Europe and not in the United States, because my higher education, my master's was here. My network was here. And I wanted to build and foster that network rather than start over again in the US.
So what about your teaching? Let's go back to that. What do you love the most about teaching here at Lund University?
What do I love most? I mean, I keep harping on this same topic, but it really is the international environment, because I do teach and I do love teaching Swedes. So let me preface with that. But I teach Swedes at the bachelor level. And then I teach international courses at the master's level. And there's just a huge difference in the engagement and the conversations. And, that could be something to do with bachelor's versus master's education. But I think it really is that international diversity brings so much to the classroom debate, because people have so many different experiences. So we'll talk about, I teach courses on political engagement, which is things like protests and activism, going back to the digital media connection. And we just get to hear about so many different examples and experiences from really all over the world. Like, okay, how does this work in China, where there's a completely different internet? You know what I mean? Or South America, where students have participated in protests in Chile, for example. And so the discussion just becomes so rich and it becomes applied. I think that's very important. We read about these theories of, one example is connective action. How do people connect and protest? Well, this is going to vary depending on what platforms people are using, the cultural and social context they grew up in. And these are not the same in every part of the world. And so we have these really important conversations about how does theory apply in different social contexts. And you can't do that when everyone comes from the same place.
That's very, very true. Now, tell me a little bit about your research, like your research area, because you won that Swedish Research Grand Prix, where you actually told people about your research in under 4 minutes, and you became the champion. So I don't know if we have 4 minutes, but tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so it really is at the intersection of social media and politics, with the big question, what is going on? Right? We hear a lot about misinformation and disinformation and all these sorts of filter bubbles, echo chambers. And I can tell you that it's never really that simple. So it's a struggle to study these platforms because so much data is generated. So a lot of my research is trying to figure out, okay, what can we learn from social media about democracy? And then secondly, how can we actually study this with so much data, millions, billions, trillions of data points that also we increasingly cannot get access to. So platforms have sort of shut down their access after things like Cambridge Analytica. So it's really a struggle. We're trying to kind of figure out what's going on in this black box with a very imperfect look at it. So what does that mean in practice? That is things like, how do politicians campaign? How do they micro-target certain citizens? What effects do those advertisements have? How do people get radicalized online? All these types of things are brought together by what is social media's role in society and politics.
And you have a podcast?
I do have a podcast on the topic.
Tell us about it.
Called Social Media and Politics, where it is interviews with other academics, but also people working for political campaigns to try to share knowledge between the two groups. And so if you're interested in political science or media or cultural studies, then what I try to do is really make books and academic theories accessible for students. And so, feel free to have a look around.
Thank you. If you could give any advice for international students navigating their experience and their career growth, what would it be?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit hesitant to give these how-tos, right? Because everyone's experience is different. But I think one generalizable piece of advice, I think, is to set a long-term and ambitious goal. Sometimes we call them dreams. To set a dream and plan, how are you going to get to that dream? But don't plan it too tight so that you have room to be flexible in your life decisions. But you really need to have this long-term goal of something that you want to achieve. And then if you achieve it, set yourself another long-term goal. And I think that helps with navigating the international experience, because it is 100% a life-changing experience to have this type of international connections with people. And it's definitely a excellent net positive, but it is hard at times. It can be lonely, can be a bit boring, depending on the situation. And even I have those moments today, having lived here for so many years. So you have to have something that motivates you through those tough times, and especially the dark Swedish winters. So set a long-term goal and think about how you're going to reach it.
What do you like most about living here?
Everything works. Everything works. Okay, the trains may be a bit delayed, whatever. But most of the time, as I mentioned before about this strong public space, it also extends not just from people and customs, but also to infrastructures and institutions. So things generally work, and they're expected to work in a certain way. And I think unlike many other countries, the public services here do work quite effectively. And so it's a very comfortable place to get around. You have good bike lanes, you have good public transport, you have good healthcare, right? You have all these necessities that allow you to focus on other, perhaps more important things in terms of achieving that big goal. So that's why I like living here, because many of the day-to-day tasks are smooth and efficient once you figure them out. There's a bit of a learning curve, but once you get it, it's a nice society to be in.
3 words on your student experience in Lund.
Yes. So you're probably expecting adjectives, but I'm going to give you nouns. Right. So the first, internationalization. I think I've talked at length about that. Then take apart the inter and the national, and you have nation, which is the student life at university, which I think is a very important part. And then I didn't really have a great third one to think of, but I would go with independence, because you do need a certain degree of independence in navigating the great structures that Lund offers, but they're only structures. So you need to have some agency in terms of how you maximize your time here.
Do you have a class to teach today?
Do I have a class to teach today? No, I have meetings, the things that students do luckily do not get to see. So lots of meetings, lots of writing, and classes start in November.
All right. Well, thanks for taking time to coming to talk to us.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Been really nice. Thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Lund University International Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Lund University, you can go to our website, lunduniversity.lu.se. And if you're already a student or an alumni and want to know more about the Alumni Network, please visit the Alumni tab on the website. You can also follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and X, and you can chat with current students on Unibuddy. Don't forget to subscribe, and we look forward to bringing you a new episode very soon.